And we're live. It is Sunday, June 14th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, which I believe covers not just me and Kate, but also our mystery guests. I'm not going to mention any other time zones because they don't matter. It is another gorgeous day in Washington. It is mid-June and I'm sitting outside and I'm not sweating. And as with yesterday, this is just the temptation of God to go socialize and spread the coronavirus. But I am here resisting. I am here in lieu of fun with you. Kate, today the monologue is yours.
Yeah, no, it's not. I prearranged for Mike to do it.
Because Mike is one of the great monologuists of the world. So Mike, our mystery guest, and now the spiel.
Yeah, I'm Mike. Monogamist. What is the word? What is the word where they change a hard
monologist? You may be a monogamist as well, but you're certainly a monologist. That I have firsthand, like 5,000 pieces of evidence of. Right. How many episodes of The Gist are there?
1,500, something like that. Seth Meyers announced his 1,000th show, and I think closer to 2,000 than 1,000, and that surprised me. I guess they take a lot of days off on network TV. I never do.
Yeah,
I'm listening to you, but my partner just got back from the grocery store, so we have to unload groceries. So I'm listening.
Are you good?
All right, so Mike, the monologue is yours.
Okay, so I did a version of this on The Gist a couple of years ago, but I'm going to slightly tweak it. And it's a serious one. It's about one of the most important issues of the day. And I was thinking a lot about the idea of white privilege. And I think that one important thing for us to do is, while acknowledging and thinking about white privilege, also not let go of the very real idea of Black oppression. And I have been charting the rise of the concept of white privilege, and it was in the academy, and then it started to be mainstreamed. And when it was mainstreamed, it was first called white skin privilege, and then the skin dropped out of it, I think, for good reasons. And I understand why, if you were a Black American, you wouldn't want to constantly hear noises about Black oppression, because the word oppression does put the onus on the oppressed to some degree. How about we reverse this? Let's talk about what's causing the oppression, something like white privilege. The thing is, as I think about John Rawls and Veils of Ignorance, there are so many things that get tied up to the idea of white privilege that really are better thought of as Black oppression. To take a couple. One, voter suppression. How does it privilege me? If I was a totally amoral but rational actor, how would it privilege me as a white person to have the votes of Black people suppressed, oppressed? It would just skew, if I was committed to a democratic experiment, it would just skew that experiment greatly. It's no privilege, it is an oppression. Then you take over incarceration. Again, if I had no sympathy, and of course I do, enormous sympathy and empathy, but if all I cared about was my own tax dollars and, for not having a carceral state for no reason, this doesn't privilege me. This causes resources that can be better spent elsewhere, like for me to be spent policing people and housing people who don't belong to be policed and housed. It is not a privilege for Black people to be over-incarcerated, for Black people to be put in jail for crimes that white people maybe wouldn't commit. I mean, this brings me to another one, which is one of the first ways that I think a college student is taught this. When you smoke marijuana at a Fish concert, I'm dating myself, around 1994, you might get a slap on the wrist. Same kid who does it, who's a Black kid, he might lose his scholarship. He might lose standing. Now, is that a privilege? Think about what we want the de facto fairness of society to be. Do we want it to be that you lose so much for getting busted once for smoking marijuana? Or do we want it to be more, hey, don't do that again, kid? And so I think in all these examples, what we think of, or what is framed these days as privilege, really is just a question of Black oppression. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of white privilege and white skin privilege and ways to think about this and ways to unpack it. But this to me is just a call to let us not forget that unfairness is visited upon the people that we're being unfair to. If we have a standard for what society is or should aspire to, and we don't allow some people to reach that standard, the people who do aren't privileged. It's the people who are denied that standard who are oppressed. There's my monologue. Thoughts?
I like it. So, well, so this is the part where we never get to do listening to the gist, which is to now interrogate you about the monologue.
Yeah.
So I hate the concept of privilege. I think it's, and we can go into why as a separate matter. I think it's a pernicious concept that the Academy has foisted on society. But I want to ask whether your construct here would apply as well to the notion of income inequality, right? So income inequality puts the, is a way of saying something other than, hey, there's a frickin' problem. People are poor.
Yes.
There's poverty, right? It's a way of talking about the balance that, that addresses the problem of poverty in the language of the problem of wealth.
Right.
And which makes sense if you're Charles Dickens and it's the, first sentence of Tale of Two Cities, but may make a lot less sense if you're a society trying to figure out how to, and so I guess my question is, isn't your point generalizable that we have this tendency to, rather than facing our problems, look at a whole lot of people and say, you better eat your spinach because there are starving people in the Eastern Congo, right? And, to frame the problem of grave societal oppression or disadvantage in the language of the problem of, which may or may not be a real problem, in the language of societal advantage.
So I want to, before you answer, Mike, I want to kind of ride off of what Ben just said, which is actually that I'm going to make the case for privilege, even though I also don't and the terminology around it, even though I also kind of have some of the qualms that you raise. So here's how I think about what the term privilege has done for our society, about how we talk about race. I think that there's that great, and I use this when I talk about internet law, but I think it's applicable here. There's that great David Foster Wallace joke where he's there are two little fish swimming in the ocean, and one fish says, they pass a grandfather fish, and the grandfather's fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And then he swims on, and one fish turns to the other fish and says, "What's water?" And that, I kind of think, is what the conversation around privilege is trying to teach us. It's trying to be hey, look at everything that you take for granted. And look at everything that you have, and you never have to worry about, because you're white or a woman or a male or don't have disabilities or don't live with chronic pain or aren't blind or whatever it is. And there's an unlimited amount of stuff like that. But in the most generous kind of understanding of when people talk about privilege, I think it's really about trying to get people to be empathetic towards other humans. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is it becomes this finger pointing bullshit that I think is garbage. But I want to make the case for maybe instituting a much more dynamic, thoughtful idea of privilege, which is that is very holistic. I, as a white woman, don't worry about getting shot or thought people accusing me of shoplifting or doing what I never even occurs to me when I walk into a store, right? I don't worry when I meet with my students, even though I always meet with them with the door open as a matter of I don't worry about being accused of of me sexually harassing them or something like that. And so there are certain things that are built into various constructs that we have. And I just kind of think that the entire movement of privilege in its best iteration should be a movement about empathy and not a movement about naming and shaming.
Right. So yes, it has taken the form of empathy at the point of a scream or a finger point or a Twitter screen. That is true. I think privilege as an idea, when I first heard about it, or just as a concept, as a conceptual framework, is a really interesting way for you to orient yourself in the world. And so I might say, oh, why does this female newscaster, why isn't she seen as authoritative as I do? Probably because as a man with a deepish voice, I'll come across, it just always has been the case that I'll come across as more authoritative. I'm probably less authoritative. That's my privilege. There are examples of this, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's maybe become more of, oh, here's a way to look at the world. That's interesting. Let's reorient ourselves and let's address the oppression. That should be the action item. But what Ben is saying is true. Whenever you have a statistic or you're trying to point out the way the world works and you're doing it in relativistic terms, it's a lot less clean than just flat out saying the thing as it is. For instance, we have a big problem in our society with poverty and privation. Way too many people don't have enough in our society. Now, I mean, the thought experiment is, what if I made, the top 1%, Bill Gates and all his cronies, 10% less wealthy, but I made you 2% less wealthy? That would go to the question of income inequality, wouldn't it? That would supposedly be solving income inequality. But of course, no one would take that. So there are ways that are dodges, I think. There are ways we use income inequality and privilege to blind ourselves from the right answers. But then there are also interesting ways. There are legitimate uses or ways to think of as income inequality. Like the Gini coefficient is an interesting way to look at a country and the fairness of a country. Or if you're talking about, one geographic area where people essentially have to pay rent and are vying for limited space, then income inequality maybe is more important than just overall absolute levels of income. But in general, just as statistics, expressing things as related to each other, not as clean and not as worthwhile, really doesn't give you as much insight as just saying, hey, in this country, Black people have to wait online for 45 minutes to vote and drive 28 minutes, and white people have to wait for 4 minutes and drive 3 minutes, or whatever the statistics are.
So I want to attack the concept of privilege a little bit here and vamp at the risk of offending some people in the audience and just have you respond to it. It seems to me the concept of privilege is useful only in a relative sense. So if I walk down the street and I'm not molested by cops and I don't feel any sense of threat from cops, we shouldn't, as you point out, we shouldn't talk. The problem is not that I don't have that experience. The problem is that somebody else does. And to dismiss or to say the perspective of having what we would hope as a normative matter would be the average experience, the common experience, is a privilege, is actually comparing the rights that we purport to take seriously with a kind of aristocratic, kind of sheltered well-being. And I don't want to dismiss it that way. I mean, I think if somebody or some group of people, and I'm quite convinced that somebody and some group of people do not enjoy that, that is not a function of my privilege or your privilege. That is a function of, as you put it, their oppression. And that is a different problem. And I think a lot of the time that we talk about privilege, what we're really talking about, I mean, I agree with your point, but I think it's much more generalizable than that. When women complain that they cannot be taken seriously in a meeting, the problem is not that I can be taken seriously in a meeting. The problem is that they can't. And to describe being taken seriously in a meeting as a position of privilege seems to me to sort of subtly misstate the sort of confuse something to which you might be elevated to something that we should just all expect. So I'm I guess I want to come back to the question of whether your spiel is actually a profoundly generalizable point that suggests that our rhetoric of this is simultaneously dismissive of people who have this privilege or these privileges, but also subtly conveys to people who don't that it is something that might someday be granted to them, rather than something that they should just demand.
Yeah. So I think maybe a general concept is let us, in using a veil of ignorance, write the laws of our society or the norms of meetings or interactions, and how should they be? And the people who are denied this, how they should be, not in a nirvanic state, but just the rules of society that we say, yes, we should all be able to, not get arrested for petty things and be able to protest without being beaten. All right. All the norms, the people who are denied these norms are oppressed. It's not that the people who enjoy the norms are privileged. Now, there are people who are privileged, right? Jeffrey Epstein, as related to the legal system, was privileged. But you and I, Ben, by not getting arrested for the last 3 times we were stopped for speeding versus our black colleagues are not privileged, right? It's the black colleagues who are arrested for going 4 miles over the speed limit and then cuffed. They are oppressed.
Or let's take an example that you and I both have a very immediate experience with, which is there is simply no way that if you or I were covering for CNN one of the protests that would have been arrested,
Probably,
right?
Yes,
and
what's that? Slugged like the Australian journalist, right? In a fit of violence, something could happen. But for the police to go through all the steps to cuff us, probably not.
Right. Just it's somewhere between highly unlikely and unthinkable, particularly if a camera were pointed at us. And by the way, I think that's good. I have no problem with that. My problem is that and so I don't think of that as a privilege. I think of that as more of as a right.
Okay, so hold on, but like these things are so interrelated, not to be like legal scholar, like dropping in and being like, okay, like, but like for the love of God, what's the difference between a fine and a tax? Like, what is the fucking difference? Like, I've never understood it for as long as I've been studying this stuff, and I've thought about it a lot. And like, people will give you various definitions, but actually, like, a fine is just kind of about is like no different than a tax. It's just more directed at certain types of behavior. It's not clear to me. It's like you're talking about these positive rights versus negative rights. You're talking about privileges versus oppression. But like, what are you saying? Like, in terms of like, what is the purpose? If like Mike and Ben, you guys not getting a speeding ticket isn't a privilege, then like, what work do you think it does better to call it like an oppression of another group?
It's really, I think it's a really important difference, actually. I'm curious if Mike agrees. Because when you call it a privilege, it is used as a way to silence the perspectives or to delegitimize the perspectives of the people who have it. Whereas when you call it a right, it seems to me to make outrageous the fact that other people don't have it. And I actually don't think it is appropriate for somebody to say, shut up. I don't want to hear your perspective because you're a privileged person. That's a. On the other hand, if somebody says, hey, as somebody whose voice has been diminished, I think I have something important to say here. I have almost infinite solicitude for that. And those are very different statements, and the vocabulary with which we use to describe the situation matters a great deal for that. Mike, I'm curious what yours of it is.
Well, first of all, Kate, I would say the correct analogy is between, not to ask what's the difference between a fine and a tax, it's what's the difference between a credit and a fine. And if 90% of the people are getting a credit, wouldn't the other 10% be said to be fine? And this raises the homeownership credit. That would be a good example of a privilege as it correlates to wealth, as it correlates to whiteness, right? So there is something where you would, if you were to say that is a privilege, I would be open to thinking about that. But I would agree with it. Ben, I think, is right, and Ben wrote the book on norms, and that's the demerit of looking through the world through the privilege lens. We have to articulate what our norms are. And our norms are things like, I think, an incarceration rate a lot lower than what we have. And by navigating the world as if looking out for the people who don't hit the norms, who are denied the norms of standard society, and to look out to try to elevate them as opposed to for the people in the privileged class to give up a little, is probably the better, more efficient way to do it. There are exceptions, right? Reeves at Brookings wrote the book, The Dream Hoarders, and he was on The Gist, and we debated a little, but perhaps to some extent, do the wealthy people in the meritocracy keep the spoils for themselves? And perhaps to some extent, by giving up their privilege, their places in the meritocracy, do you open it up for the less privileged? But overall, I think if you look at privilege, to go back to what you said, Kate, as an interesting thought experiment where I say to myself, and I do believe this, that the world, America 2020, more or less made for white men, from everything from the, de facto color of Band-Aids to what the late night hosts look like, okay? Just kind of made for white people, and think about privilege in that way, useful. But to think about these things that everyone should have and they don't have it, I think it's more urgent to talk about oppression.
So I think that's maybe great, because I think that gets
that's all I could ever hope for.
No. But I think that gets us into this amazing conversation about the systemic nature of these things, because what you just said, the two things, the color of Band-Aids, and who the late night talk show hosts are hugely defining. Like, I have never thought of a late night, if you threw up a platonic ideal of a late night talk show host, it would never be a woman. It would never be a person of color. That would forever change, how people grow up thinking that what they can do, and all of these other types of things, right? Mm-hmm. What is not fair is to put all of that on every white male that ever exists, ever, period. Yeah.
Or the very talented white men who host late night talk shows, right?
They just were doing what they were doing because this is the society that was built for them, and they didn't, And so I think that this is the same thing as I said, I had a rant about this. Well, not a huge rant, but a tweet about this, which was how people talk is so important. I say a lot, and I will have a monologue about this at some point. I say a lot. I have some filler words, but I don't even, no offense, Ben, I don't say I don't have filler words even as much as you do, I don't think. And no one calls you on that in the show.
So,
and
so that is such an interesting point, Kate. Kate says a kind of average amount, mm-hmm. In the sense that a person of her generation says I had tweeted a whole thread about this, and you wouldn't believe the caliber of person who responded to me. You shouldn't be encouraging Kate to say It went
viral. It was just it was crazy. Yeah, and I was like, fuck you.
I say all the time. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever calls me on it. Nobody ever calls me. I use filler words all the time. I can do it without doing it like I'm doing now. I can speak in fluid, mellifluous sentences that begin at the beginning of the sentence and end at the end of the sentence, period. I usually don't talk that way. Sometimes I do it strategically to kind of get people on my side, because I find that when I talk in this mellifluous, continuous kind of way, people find it alienating, because they find it to be sort of professorial and didactic, and they find a little more sympathy and empathy with me if I'm a little more halting. So as a strategic matter, I often do that, particularly at the beginning of speeches. Now, for all of you in the audience who are thinking, oh my God, I've never thought about talking this much, that's because you don't do it professionally. But what Mike Pesca, who I've never discussed this with, will tell you is if you do it professionally, you think about it a lot. Right, Mike?
You should. I believe you should. I believe many podcasters do not.
And they're less good podcasters as a result of it, right?
I think so.
But the less good thing is what I'm talking about, which is that here's what you're going to have. Like you have like multiple generations of media produced mostly by listen to like the William F. Buckley and James Baldwin conversation. They are speaking like Queen's English to each other. Like it is completely
it's stunning.
It is stunning. Like that debate in Oxford is crazy. And like women don't talk like that. And not all people of color talk like that. And not everyone talks like that. And one of the reasons the women are like systemically thought of as not as intelligent or not as robust or not as whatever, or that I am seen
not as eloquent
or less eloquent. Yes. Or like I'm seen as whatever, is that we're not used to hearing it. And the voice of authority is Walter Cronkite and like, or whoever.
But again, the problem is not, Kate, that people don't criticize me for every or don't even hear them. The problem is that people hear every like that you say, every pause, everything that they can map onto, a Frank Zappa Valley Girl song, and use it to demean you. And I accept that I am in a privileged position in not having to deal with that. But I very much agree with Mike that to focus on the privilege rather than to focus on the deprivation is to miss the point. And just so people know that I put my money where my mouth is, when Kate tweeted, this was months and months before In Lieu of Fun was a dream.
This was like years ago. This was like years ago.
It was a while ago. Kate tweeted that she sometimes says, like, I did a long tweet thread about how often I say, and how rarely I get called on it. And the fact that we have to have that interaction is a ridiculous thing. But the problem is not that I don't get called on it. The problem is that there are some assholes in our Twitter thread, in the YouTube comments that are probably right now commenting on the fact of Kate's diction. And that's obscene. But it is, again, to go back to Mike's original point in the monologue, that is a creature of the oppression, not of the privilege.
But they're probably misspelling your, and that gives me great joy.
Yes. and not your is trending today on Twitter for some reason that I can't discern.
To some extent, all of this is a proxy. All of this high-minded notion of what is privilege is a proxy for the phrase, oh, it must be nice not to take a lot of shit for saying like, for instance, oh, it must be nice to have Band-Aids in your color, right? And that just becomes a more general way to talk about privilege. I think about Barack Obama, who's the most, I think we could all agree, as among the most eloquent Americans we've seen. The filler words out of this guy, the filler sounds, as he searches for a phrase.
The vocal fry.
The vocal
fry. But totally strategic.
Well, I saw the Zoom meeting, and I think if he had, I think it was suboptimal Obama, and there was no reason for Obama not to come with A+ Obama rather than A-, except he didn't have it within him, and therefore it wasn't strategic always.
Mike, can I ask, how did you, so I had one of my professors just like tell me straight up, and this was actually fair. And I don't think it had to do with filler words. It actually had to do with how I was framing my sentences and my comfort level with speaking in front of groups. Tell me to like that he was like, you have to work on your public speaking. And I went to Toastmasters for a while and it was actually super helpful. But your monologue today was like off. Like I'm terrible at reading from scripts. I'm much better when I'm just talking like this or doing Q&A. Love that. Can do that all day long. How did you get so great at kind of public speaking? Do you have scripts? Are you good at making scripts like kind of just sound like your natural voice? Like what is it that you do?
It's his ethnic background. He's half Italian, half Jewish from Long Island.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
What,
okay, never mind. We can go to Lieu
it's
now.
Like
I know
it's injected into his blood.
Right.
But you don't do this. You have a podcast.
I mean, like I'm gonna get creamed for saying that. But like these are two argumentative cultures from the most argumentative place in the world.
Right.
And right?
Well, yes, but it doesn't mean their arguments always flow. It doesn't mean that, Anthony Scaramucci is the modern day Cicero.
Oh, yes. That is not what it means.
No, but Anthony Scaramucci thinks he's the modern day Cicero.
But it doesn't mean that Michael Cohen, when you hear him talk, you say to yourself, oh, do you have that as a book on tape?
Yes. Let's not completely reduce Mike down to his ethnic background and let him answer, please.
Yeah, how'd you learn to do it, Mike?
I thought a lot about it, and I think I'm not a great writer. I've written books, but I'm not a great writer. I think more in speaking. I listen to more podcasts probably than I read from an early age. I did something called Model Congress, and I always liked extemporaneous speaking, but I was just attuned to it. And when someone would you talk about William F. Buckley? I used to watch every firing line. And by the way,
weren't they amazing? They're so amazing.
So amazing. But this is something I'll throw out there. I think because of Buckley, to this day, the conservative press has a tendency to use vocabulary words that actually don't exist in the English language, but probably should, because
so true.
Yes. Buckley is not acceptable.
No, give me an example. What are you talking about?
No, he made erudition a virtue, even if it's fraudulent. Yes. In conservatism.
Right. So he'll take a root word and then say eyes, or, instead of elegy, he'll say elogia. And then you'll know it will have existed in the 1800s, but that's not why he said it. There's another really interesting aspect to this. And this is generational. I chafe so much at so many of the buzzwords, privilege, for instance, and I try not to. Exactly what we're talking about, not to police, there's a word, vocal fry, or saying like, I know it's wrong. I know that there were some buzzwords of my era. Probably passive aggressive was a buzzword, and a win-win situation certainly is a buzzword, and zero-sum game, all buzzwords that actually inform our knowledge. But my God, have we become inundated with buzzwords? And I'm almost finding, I don't like saying almost, and I am finding that sometimes using these words, which I suppose you have to excuse because it is the language of people younger than me, but using these words is such a turnoff that I have to say, I have to get past that the author keeps claiming erasure when what the author really is saying is insult, for instance. Or
disagreement.
Yes. And the use of, I just read something about the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And the first time I saw that, I just couldn't get past thinking about what work is this doing that POC in general wasn't doing. It bothered me so much. And I think it might be a failing or a flaw or generational, but it's something that I think about.
It's also just, I think about this all the time, but mostly because from a cognitive linguistic point of view, which is kind of like how language gets created and changed. And I find it freaking fascinating for all of the things that you talked about. So for instance, like colored as like a terminology, like the National Association of Colored Peoples, is such a denigrated term now. Yes, like it is not something that you refer to. but we're okay with people of color, which seems very strange.
And we're okay with the NAACP.
And we're okay with the NAACP.
Right? It gets grandfathered in.
Dude,
yeah,
I'm
exactly.
really into the NAACP. I don't know about you if you're only okay with them. Fine.
Yeah. But there's all of these things, and I get what you're saying. And it's very, I do think that there is an interesting evolution of language around this. And I think that it's kind of, have you read Because Internet, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, that like seems straight up your alley. I am like halfway through it. It's just like it is very much about like the rapid evolution of language online.
She's great.
And,
she was on the show.
Really?
It's so good. She
we want to get her on our show.
Have you ever had McWhorter on? He'd be great too.
Yeah, he's really smart.
Yeah.
I would love to have him.
Cool.
And he does, I could plug a Slate podcast. So he does Lexicon Valley. And when she was on, she was cavelling about talking to the great John McWhorter. It was a really nice interview.
Cool.
What's her name?
Super cool.
You have the name
Lieu, the floor is yours.
I'll look it up. Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to your monologue, it seems like you have sort of an absolute notion of privileges and oppression, whereas if you had a relative notion, then another person's oppression would by definition be your privilege. Is that a sort of correct reading of your monologue?
I mean, in a sentence, oftentimes I think that is a logical fallacy. What you just said, that someone's oppression isn't my privilege, if you want to cut through everything I said and say that accounts for not 80% of what I'm saying, I agree. That is true.
Can I just, someone brought up in the...
And one more thing, and sometimes your oppression is my oppression. In the case of if you care about fairness and you look at the carceral state, or if you don't care about fairness but care about your tax dollars, it's still a mini form of my oppression.
I was going to say that someone brought up like why, like, I mean, and this has been like a pretty white show. We've had a couple of black people of color or black people on the show. And like, I would generally say that, I just at a really practical level, I have not wanted to further tax any of my friends who are people of color during this period of time and force them to come on a show with two white people and just be like, hey, like talk about what's going on or whatever else. And that was like I don't know. We didn't talk about this, Ben, like behind the scenes or otherwise, or like, but I just like purposefully did not kind of like, we didn't do that. And I'm kind of like fine with us not doing that. I didn't, the show is what it is. It's the people that we know. Some of that does reflect the fact that we like know, like, that there just are not like people of color in some of like the circles that we run in. And that in fact, like reflects a lot of systemic injustice. But I didn't want to like bring on a bunch of my friends that are people of color that are just going to be tokenized on the show. That just felt gross. I just wasn't into it.
Well, I share your aversion to tokenism, but I also believe in bringing on the full diversity of our acquaintance and in a non-tokenized way. So
no. I mean, and we will. I just like want to wait till this moment passes because it feels inevitable that if they come on into a show in this moment, that's going to be, and like that's visibly what they are, that there's just like, even if they're brilliant historians or jurists or like economists, it's just like I just don't want to make it about their blackness or their color, and so like I just didn't want to do that to them. So
all right, so we have if you have a question for Mike Pesca, this is a good time. We've got about 20 minutes, but I've got a question that I've been always wanting to ask you, Mike, which is so the last time you were on the show, I asked you whether you wrote them on, whether you scripted them or whether you did them impromptu. Mm-hmm. And you acknowledged that you mostly script them.
That's right.
But my question is, how do you make it sound when I write something down and then I read it? It sounds like I'm reading. Mm-hmm. When you write something, when you script something, it sounds like you're just talking to me.
But do you
and
write,
like
but
the thing?
do you write what you would say, or do you write what you would want to be read?
Well, I don't know. I'm an essayist, so I kind of write in essay form. But
Right.
like you have this incredible skill of sounding like you're just talking to people.
You'd be a good speechwriter, Mike.
And my
like
question is, how do you do that? What are the elements of that?
So I don't know if you've noticed this, but for the most part, the skills don't overlap. If you're an all-time great writer, you're often not, I mean, you're almost never an all-time great speaker, and vice versa. And an exception was Christopher Hitchens, and I dug deep into what made him so eloquent on the page.
I'm so glad you brought it. I feel like he is like William F. Buckley's like successor in so many ways.
Right. Both his doppelganger and his photo negative. So he would, from what I understand, I think would think in written prose, but then memorize large swaths of statements, and it would come trippingly from the tongue. In fact, he also knew a lot of Shakespeare, and so that was always good to fall back on, to have the classic education. I envy him that. Another form of eloquence, by the way, if you have a whole bunch of quotes at the ready, you'll always get invited back to cable news because they'll think you're really smart. But I do think that the main reason is, like I said, I'm not a great writer. I mean, you can read things I've written, and sometimes you'll say, oh, that was a good point, maybe because you hear me saying it. But I think it's hard to be both. It's hard to think in both modes. And if you've ever read just a book, even a great book by a stand-up comic, it's sometimes very funny. I mean, Steve Martin's Born Standing Up was really good, but it's a kind of a different genre than his comedy, and it's not as good as his comedy. So I just don't think you could do both.
That's so interesting. I do both.
That's interesting.
I mean, I feel like I'm not like a comedian, but like I feel like I like but when I write I used to be a speechwriter very briefly. I think I was actually kind of good at it and could have done it. It was but I to this day, like, just write things the first time in kind of speech form of like me just like riffing on stuff. And then
a speechwriter is a playwright for one character.
Oh, that's true.
But I don't buy this, because your monologues are well crafted. They're well written. They're not, if you reformulated them as essays, they would work as essays. You'd have to get rid of the sort of parentheticals, which you do as sort of asides. But they're very plausible as written work, and yet they sound like you're talking to me. Mm-hmm. They sound conversational. And I'm trying to identify what are the aspects of something like that doesn't sound like a speech. It doesn't sound like you're reading something at me. I literally once the last time you were on the show, had to ask you whether you're scripting them or whether you're over recording and then cutting and doing it in an improvisational fashion, which is how I would do it. There's got to be some elements to that. Like, I can tell you what the element is, what the elements of an op-ed are. What are the elements of a spoken monologue that sound like you're giving you're answering a question at a cocktail party? Right.
So some things are very short sentences and not sentences laden with dependent clauses that run into themselves like curlicues. I mean, I will say this, I come from NPR, and I think some of the greatest reporters, but the people who held the air the best at NPR are people who have a somewhat theatrical background. They at least all did theater in high school. So Robert Smith, Brooke Gladstone. I don't know if Nina Totenberg did theater in high school, but she loves theater, and she does Gilbert and Sullivan, and she's drawn to things like that. So I think that's it's not coincidental to me. The people who are the least stilted have a little bit of the ham and the showman in them. And then they, over years and years and years, they learn how to write for the air and they care about it. I do think also a lot of people, I can't tell you how many people at podcasts, maybe it's not their main job, and they say, I don't listen to myself. Do you read yourself after a first draft? I mean, how do you not listen to yourself? This is what you're saying. This is your means of communication.
I read myself after a first draft, but it's painful and it's really hard. And I've like written about this, like I get a final edit back from like a law review article. It's like a 70-page piece. And I feel like it's nails on chalkboard. Everything.
You read it out loud?
No, I don't read it out loud, but like, I will say
I never let something go to press with my name on it that I have not read out. Never.
To who? Who the hell are you reading
Myself.
it to?
I want to know when I write something, I want to know how it sounds. And I tell my students, I make my students read stuff out loud when we do a class. If you're going to do, and I don't let them use punctuation that you can't pronounce, like S/HE. Like, if you can't pronounce it out loud, it's nothing against gender neutral pronouns. I'm all for figuring out ways to be gender neutral. But if you can't read it out loud, it's not English. It's some code. And, but yet when I read my stuff out loud, it doesn't sound anything like Mike Pesca. Right? Because Mike Pesca sounds like you're having a conversation with him.
Another aspect might be there's no equivalent to the intimacy of what you can do with your voice. I think NPR got a little too into it. Radio is the most intimate medium, and they get all up on the mic, and we know the delicious dish. But when you think of some of the most compelling talkers, Tony Kornheiser, he will get a little soft, and he will draw you in, and he will make his point. I'm doing a Tony Kornheiser that's maybe more maudlin than Kornheiser, but he uses, so if there's an X and Y axis, whatever that would be with writing, there is also the Y and the Z in terms of voice intonation with speaking. And
that with local TV news has that, like, I'm here today with there's this kind of like this like crazy kind of,
but I do think the very non thought out quick twitch muscle version of that is if you think something is impactful, you lean into it even more and emphasize it. This is very specific. But what I find is when something's like when something is a real gut shot, that's exactly when you pull back and you just don't give it a little bit of mustard. You just pull back and say it starkly and maybe get a little quieter or maybe get a little less intonated. It's performance, right? Monologues are performance. It's you're an actor and a playwright at the same time. God, I sound so highfalutin when I say that.
Oh my gosh, no! It sounds like
it's so interesting.
It is fascinating. Because you don't
your
realize
voice, because your voice is so distinctive. All right, Rachel Coit, the floor is yours.
Hi, I had initially, my question was about if people had recommended that you guys get speaking coaching when you started speaking more in public. And if so, what did that entail? I'm a woman in academia, and it has been exclusively other women who have said to me and have coached me on my,
Sorry, my computer started yapping at me.
Oh.
I didn't mean to have you cut over by a weather report, but a Richmond television station seemed to want to interrupt you. The floor is yours.
No worries. And so, it's exclusively other women who have basically sat me down and said, this is how you need to be talking when you're giving, and I'm in STEM, so I'm speaking mostly to a scientific audience. And I don't know if you would equate giving a scientific presentation with monologuing. I think they're probably very, very different mediums, but the the mentor aspect of learning to become a better public speaker. I was wondering if you guys could talk about.
Rachel, that's like such a great question. I think that there's
Such a great question.
Yeah. And so like, I kind of think that there was, when I was doing this, I was actually kind of like borderline STEM. Like I was like doing my PhD in cognitive psychology / law, and then like ended up mostly being in law. But I would say that there was it's so interesting across. I don't want to give you terrible advice because Caitlin is probably mostly Rachel is mostly dealing with, I don't know why I say Caitlin, I just saw it on my screen. That's why. See, how do you not deal with stuff like that? Like, doesn't everyone have moments where they just kind of blip out? Anyways, Rachel's question is, I think, kind of perfect because there is a lot of differences between various areas of academia. So for instance, like Rachel, if you have kind of a presenting in psychology, in a psychology background, at least when I was at Yale, the traditional way that people present in a psychology room was like this incredibly elaborate and really, really, really well done PowerPoint presentation that was very intricate with all of the data graphs and all of the sourcing and all of like kind of like the metrics and all of like the p-values and everything else. Okay. And I was kind of overwhelmed by how great people were at knowing all of their data and everything that was going into that. They just like had it all on the top of their mind. But of course it was like their entire lives. So you could kind of understand why it was like at the top of their mind. Versus going to a law school, and there would all of a sudden be like, you know, the keynote speaker could just like ramble on for 30 or 40 minutes about anything he or she wanted to, mostly he wanted to, and like have no type of like data, no type of point, no type of like necessary beginning or ending, that like kind of these things were very distinct. I do think that generally, like, that there is value. I got a lot of value out of doing, I know it sounds really dorky, but doing what was it called? The Toastmasters. I'm like, see, I'm like terrible at this. This is actually like a bad tick that I have, which is like when I have to think of something, the name of a thing, I can never remember it at that exact moment. Like it's, it's not.
Wait till you turn 48 or 50.
Yeah, but it's like really bad. And sometimes I remember the exact opposite of whatever it was that I was trying to say. And then I say it anyway. It was just like, so my point is that basically like that those types of things were really valuable to me. Watching other people speak was just valuable. I think Mike had this. How did
you learn to speak, Mike?
Would the opposite of Toastmasters be bred submissives? Just throwing that out there. I'm going for the spit take. I tried to time it.
Really good. Very nice.
I was blessed.
It was like, yes. I mean, like, yes, it was like, but it was like, it actually like okay, so there was no one in my socioeconomic class in my Toastmasters. Like, it was all English as a second language people. And it was mostly people trying, and like a few other really excellent speakers that were like motivational speakers. And it was a weird kind of little mix, but it was kind of great. It was just like so amazing to
those
see.
Programs that seem dorky or old but have been around for a while, not just Toastmasters, are really, really great. David Epstein, who is just about the best nonfiction writer of like sports and science, who wrote Range. He's told me that before he started writing, he took an online fiction writing class. I mean, there's nothing special about it. There's no secret, but the fact that these classes have obtained for years and years and years tells you that people are getting something out of it. So that, I think, is really valuable.
Yeah, and it's not like we're not gonna make you brilliant. If you don't have something brilliant to say or brilliant to do, then like it's not gonna do it for you. But like if you do, it'll help. I think it does help.
But yet, how did you learn to speak, Mike? Was it like around the kitchen table in the Italian Jewish home, or was it something more deliberate than that?
Yeah, my dad was a social studies teacher, and he was a very good orator. And he emphasized it, and we watched things where the value of the orally expressed word was valued. We listened to a lot of AM talk radio, and from a young age, I would call in fact, to AM talk radio. And when I was 10 years old, I would call into the local station, WGBB, where they discussed the Jets. And I got a regular segment as a 10-year-old talking about Jets football. I don't know.
That's adorable. Wait, Mike,
I used to
how
call
many
Larry.
radi-
I used to call Larry King when he had an AM talk radio show, and he once had to scold me because I said rhetorically, by means of saying that the president this was President Reagan, had been, I was probably like 14 at the time, and I meant to. I don't remember what Reagan had done that was wildly inappropriate in my 14-year-old judgment, but I said something like, well, Larry, the president should really be shot for what he said tonight. and Larry King said to 14-year-old me, you mean the president should be severely criticized, right? And I said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And I did not receive a visit from the Secret Service. And I've always had a soft spot in for Larry King ever since then as a result.
You say what?
Yeah, exactly. Fortunately, Fox News did not exist at the time, so they didn't do 14-year-old threatens president.
You want to hear something funny? When I was in 7th grade, Mr. Sheehan, who was the teacher of the class, we did a project called, I think it was called Olympics of the Mind. And long story short, we did a song parody, and the parody was to Beethoven's, not Ode to Joy, but it's the one that goes, oh, maybe we should. Da, 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 da,
Oh, it's a waltz.
Oh, okay.
Isn't it?
We were a news.
That's like the Nutcracker.
I think it's maybe the Nutcracker. We were a newscast, and I remember the line, today's top story is, I shouldn't sing, Reagan was shot in the head. It doesn't make a difference. He's always been brain dead.
Oh my God.
So we did that and previewed it for the superintendent of the school district, and he would have the final word if it was appropriate, and he loved it. That's the funniest thing ever.
You loved it?
So the answer
Excellent.
is, I was an indulged youth.
You were
Well, I would like to say that this is exactly how I imagine this is what America is like. This is what America should be about. It's like this type of complete like parody of shooting, and not the actual like of all of our leaders. I think that that's like completely fine. I love that. That's adorable.
I just want to say, Mike Pesca and I, born 2 years apart, both at some level professional writer, talker types, both referenced the president getting shot as teenagers. Yeah. Nate Perry, the floor is yours. You get the last question.
So I think I thought of a better way to ask this question after hearing Rachel speak in particular. So my experiences in schools, I've been in and around schools for quite some time. When people start out in their presentation or public speaking, particularly in K-12, but extending all the way through professional school, it seems that most students' experiences have this idea of their public speaking is attached to evaluation. It's attached to grading. There's always a rubric and there's always a judgment. And I've seen this in practice create very vicious feedback loops of people saying, well, I'll never get there. I'll never be able to be a good trial attorney because I got this feedback sheet that just said, I'm a shitty speaker. And and we don't like that. We want to focus on the specific. So this seems to be a spread of K-12 public school, like an entire systemic issue. How do we disaggregate the evaluatory or judgment components from the practice components?
Such a great question. Mike, I have some thoughts on this, but you go first.
Yeah, it's hard because in what circumstance would one get their reps in public speaking, right? It's either a competition, which you'll always get feedback or evaluation, or it's literally a class with feedback or evaluation. So maybe the answer is for and this probably goes against pedagogical best practices, but maybe the answer is to include an oral component in all classes. And so maybe there'll be some feedback, but not much more than, anything else. Maybe requiring the students to stand up and voice what they're thinking. I could see why this would be met with disapproval for people who would be traumatized for doing that, but maybe that's an answer to Nate's question.
Hey, what do you think? I
have really vigorous class participation mechanisms in place for my 1Ls in particular. I give a ton of class participation engagement, and I really honestly credit for engagement. And then I guess I'm trying to think, no one liked me. I was like the Tracy Flick that always raised her hand, except I wasn't really the Tracy Flick because it wasn't really I wanted to be in government or whatever, but I always raised my hand. I always was interested in what we were studying. I was fascinated by everything, and I was a huge dork and no one liked me. And
you're not traumatized by that at all.
Yeah, right. That's not that's not why I went into what I do now. But I will say that I would say solidly half of the teachers that I learned from were really supportive of me, and half of them were nasty and ended up actually really disliking me because I always raised my hand and always had questions. And there was a few I'm not going to go into them, a few moments in which that was made clear to the entire class.
Ms. Houlihan?
No, Miss Houlihan was not one of them. Actually, there was another one, but I do think that oh man, encouraging, I know this is terrible. This is actually, I shouldn't say this, maybe even. I make fun. There's I have a very kind of interesting, I teach at a law school that is predominantly from Long Island. And it's predominantly there's a lot of white guys, and they tend to raise their hands a lot and answer a lot of questions. And I tend to call on them. And then I also if they've raised their hands a bunch, that volunteers them for getting made fun of for various types of things. And so I tease the heck out of them. Right. And I tease the heck out of them. And then when there's kind of, I'm I don't do that to others. I mean, or to women or people of color, but I make fun of the white guys. They kind of get it. And they kind of lean into it and they're fine with it. And it's okay. But this is kind of how I try to normalize, Tracy raised her hand and got it exactly right. And this is what I want to hear. And unlike Paul over here, who and I'd make some joke, but there's it's a really dangerous game to play. And I kind of understand that. And I do it anyway, because I just don't know how else to kind of to level the playing field in a 90-person class. And also just really genuinely get women ready for oral advocacy in a field where they're going to have to do that for the rest of their lives. I don't know, so that's kind of a big part of it.
Yeah, so I think Kate's last point is really important. This is a highly, highly gendered question. And there are a lot of guys who are, way too eager to talk a lot with too little information and too little thought, and way too many women who are uneager to talk even when they know a great deal more about the question at hand than anybody else in the room. And I don't know, I don't know a solution to that problem other than very active intervention. And I'm not just talking about a classroom setting here. I'm talking about meetings. I'm talking about all kinds of other settings as well. It's very, very visible in classroom settings. And you know, I do think, look, I mean, if I had to change one thing about high school curricula, it would be that no no girls should get out of high school without studying martial arts and public speaking. And you know, and the two are related. They're both connected to this sort of ineffable value that we call charisma, which is related to confidence. And I I think we have not given enough thought to that that how we train to confidence and how we how we train to charisma. And so, like, you know, the last time Mike was on the show, it was with Virginia Heffernan, who's also an incredible monologuist and also has this amazing confidence about the way she talks. And I think one of the really cool things about the Slate podcast world is just that it has these people who are, you know, confidently charismatic and interesting and just kind of know they're interesting, not in an arrogant way, not in a, you know, an asshole-ish way, just in a, hey, these are interesting people, let's have them talk to you. And that people really respond to that. And I really hope that a lot of women hearing Mike Pesca's deep voice think, that's cool that he does that. I can do that. You know, I'm a really good talker too. But I worry, and I worry this about myself too, that people do associate it with that confidence, that charisma, with the timbre of the voice, rather than with the qualities of being a good talker, which is actually a gender neutral proposition. So I don't know. I think Nate's question is a deep one, and I worry about it. I don't know how you train people to that, except that I think training people to charisma and competence. Many more people are spiritually, internally charismatic than are externally charismatic.
Well,
and I think teaching people to turn that outward is a real challenge and a really interesting problem.
And I'd be interested to hear if you agree with this, Mike, and I hope you can close us out. But I was just going to say that, like, it seems like a demand side problem, not a supply side problem. Go and support women who are doing podcasts, people of color who are doing podcasts. Do that, like, because you supporting them, you sending them positive comments or emails makes them feel better, makes them feel more confident in what they're doing. It's a huge,
and
huge
don't send
thing.
them comments about their filler words. Just don't do it. Don't tweet about their vocal fry. Just don't.
Yeah.
Even if it annoys you. Just, you know, it's not like they've never heard this before, that if you say to them, you know, Kate, you use the word like a lot, you should stop that. She's going to say, my God, I've never thought of that.
I do try all the time to not use the word like as much, and I don't. I go
try
back
not to say you know.
Or yeah.
But nobody calls me on it.
Mike,
close us out.
Yeah.
Close us out. And thank you again for being our mystery guest. This was really fun. It was a fun Sunday. Thank you for making our Sunday nights.
Well, I love it. I listen to most of your shows or watch most of your shows, but this is a weird one for me because it's on single speed and I let them bank and then I watch them on double speed, just chew them up. So it's fantastic.
I don't know how you do that.
I do that too.
Double's not even fast enough for me.
It's not even fast enough.
Yeah.
I mean,
you talk at double speed, but like I can't do double. Like when I listen to a podcast, I want to hear the person in roughly the register that their voice actually exists in.
Oh no, they don't. This whole discussion was talking about the inadequacies that we all feel about our own voices. And yet you're saying, but then the product that comes out, that is the pristine product that it must be experienced in. No, you can double it up. I wish I could talk twice as fast as I do. So I will say this.
Is it hard for you to exist in daily life, Mike?
When I lived in the South, it was a little hard. Like, come on. But I think your guys from, went to Chaminade High School and then maybe Ithaca College at St. John's. It's more my ilk, right? Maybe half Hollow Hills High School. I would say, I will give you this. I think it's a supply side problem. Wait, is that what we said? Did we say supply or demand? Anyway, my point is
demand side.
Right. When there is a wonderfly eloquent female speaker, I think it's a bit of a superpower. People don't even realize that. Our last editor-in-chief at Slate, Julia Turner, is unbelievably eloquent, and it's just inspiring to hear her in meetings, even if you weren't agreeing with what she was saying. It was a joy. And the more and more people who you come across like that, the more you appreciate it. So you're ready for the really most simple piece of advice, and this is very practical. And it's to put one foot in front of the other. And you're saying, oh my God, I can't believe you're ending on a cliche. No, I don't mean it in terms of that. I mean it in terms of a big problem with public speaking is that you get up on your feet and you sway. The public speakers sway. So all you do is take a step and you put one foot in front of the other, keep the other foot planted, and you will not sway. It is impossible to sway if your feet are not aligned. That is my advice. I helped you from swaying while public speaking.
So this is a brilliant ending. And to share it, to just foot stomp this point, I want to share this video from 2012 of a Richmond weather forecast, which I think I want you all to think about in your public speaking. What makes this man sound like a weatherman? Because he sounds perfectly like a weather forecaster. What is it about his forecast that sounds so perfectly like a weather forecast?
Am I gonna know this?
We had beautiful weather here for this weekend, mostly sunny skies and highs in the upper 80s. Overnight tonight, partly cloudy, mild, with those temperatures dropping down into the mid 70s. Now we've got some big changes here for the upcoming work week. Starting tomorrow, we're going to have a volcanic eruption right near Charlottesville, and it's going to make things rather toasty across the area. We're going to see lava spill out into central Virginia and make temperatures in Richmond at 350 degrees, Fredericksburg at 345, Charlottesville, the hot spot, at 400. Not as hot off towards the Tidewater. A little bit more comfortable with highs near 100 degrees. The reason why, we're going to have tidal waves moving in ahead of this, a global superstorm developing off towards the Atlantic Ocean. This thing is headed our way, but the key to the forecast, right before this thing makes landfall, it is going to be deflected by Godzilla. Now, a lot can change between now and then. We're looking at the latest data. We'll continue to bring you the very latest. I do want to encourage you, though, that if you ever do see a sleeping coyote, do not wake it. Bad idea. Okay. Here's the forecast. Volcano 350 there for Monday. Global superstorm on Tuesday. We could see maybe about 200 inches of rainfall, wind gusts up to 1,000 miles an hour. Godzilla Wednesday, I'll be honest, I have no idea what's going to happen on that day. After that, though, how about this to finish off the work week? Low humidity, lots of sunshine, with highs in the upper 80s.
So there you go. Weekend. If he can do that, if he can sound that much like a weather forecaster when predicting Godzilla and a global superstorm, and take a break to say, don't wake a sleeping coyote, you can go out there and give a monologue.
Is that a real thing that happened? Did he actually do that?
No, it's
Godzilla the size of North America combated a hurricane. It really happened.
It really happened, Kate.
Oh my God. Sorry, I'm like dying. I'm like, that's like
brilliant
perfect.
Spoof weather forecast. With that, we will be back tomorrow. We don't have a guest yet for tomorrow, do we?
No, because I think it's going to be Jonathan Zittrain, but he might be busy. Like, we have to figure it out. So we'll figure it out. But we're going to have a guest tomorrow.
We will have a guest tomorrow. And if we don't, fuck it. What do we say until then, Kate?
We're getting to the tail end of In Lieu of Fun. Yeah.
Until then, what do we say?
If you can't have fun in lieu of fun, you can at least exercise your incredible amount of privilege over everyone else.
That's right. Thank you, Mike.